They don't miss you. They miss having control over you. And when you walk away, what they feel isn't heartbreak. It's collapse. Because behind that cold, unaffected mask, there are actually 5 stages they move through. And each one reveals more about them than it ever did about you. If this feels a little too close to home, pause for a moment and ask yourself, are you missing them? Or are you missing the version of them you hoped was real? And if you want clarity like this, make sure you stay connected because awareness is how you break free. When you walk away, the first thing that happens inside a narcissist is not emotional pain in the way most people understand it. It is disruption. Their entire internal balance depends on what psychology calls narcissistic supply, the steady stream of attention, validation, admiration, and even emotional reactions they pull from others. You were not just a partner or someone in their life. You were a primary source of that supply. So when you leave, it creates a sudden vacuum, almost like pulling oxygen out of a room they didn't even realize they depended on. This is why the initial reaction is shock, but it's a very specific kind of shock. It's disbelief rooted in entitlement. They genuinely assumed you would stay, tolerate, adjust, and continue meeting their needs. Your departure doesn't just surprise them. It contradicts the identity they've built where they are always the one in control, always the one being chased, never the one being left behind. In that moment, their perception of reality cracks. They may replay the last interactions, not to understand your pain, but to figure out how they lost control of the situation. What looks like emotional numbness or indifference during this stage is often a kind of internal scrambling. They may act calm, distracted, or even unaffected, but internally there is confusion because the system they rely on has been interrupted. The loss is not processed as I lost someone I love, but as something that belonged to me is no longer available. This distinction is crucial because it explains why their next moves are not about healing or reflection, but about restoring that lost sense of control as quickly as possible. In the second stage, what replaces that initial shock is not sadness, it is defensiveness, and it often shows up as anger. This is where the narcissist begins to protect their fragile self-image at all costs. At the core of this reaction is something known as narcissistic injury, a deep psychological wound that occurs when their inflated sense of self is challenged. Your decision to walk away is not processed as a personal choice. It is experienced as an attack on who they believe they are. Instead of turning inward and asking what went wrong, they immediately turn outward. Blame becomes their shield. You become too sensitive, too demanding, ungrateful, or the problem. This isn't random. It's a defense mechanism designed to avoid confronting any flaw within themselves. Accepting responsibility would mean dismantling the image they've spent so long building, and that feels far more threatening than losing you. Their anger can appear in different ways. Sometimes it's explosive, rage, accusations, attempts to provoke you into reacting. Other times, it's cold and calculated, silent treatment, dismissiveness, acting as if you never mattered. But underneath both expressions is the same purpose, to restore their sense of superiority and control. If they can convince themselves or others that you were the issue, then they don't have to sit with the discomfort of rejection. During this stage, they may also begin pulling others into their narrative. Friends, family, even social media can become tools to validate their version of events. This is often tied to projection, where they place their own behaviors or flaws onto you, reshaping reality in a way that keeps their ego intact. In the third stage, something shifts in a way that can feel incredibly confusing because this is where the narcissist seems to soften. After the anger, after the blame, they begin reaching out again. Messages, calls, apologies, even moments of vulnerability that appear genuine. This phase is driven by what is known as hoovering, a pattern where they attempt to pull you back into the dynamic once they realize their usual control strategies have failed. What makes this stage so powerful is how convincing it can be. They may say everything you once wanted to hear. They might acknowledge certain behaviors, promise change, or suddenly show emotional depth that was missing before. It can feel like regret, like realization, like growth. But underneath it, the motivation is not true accountability. It's restoration. They are trying to reestablish access to the same emotional supply you once provided. This is where many people get pulled back in because it taps directly into hope. You start to think maybe they finally understand, or maybe this time will be different. But if you look closely, the focus is rarely on your pain in a consistent, sustained way. Instead, it's on reopening the connection. The urgency is not about healing what was broken, it's about regaining what was lost. There is often a pattern here: intensity without consistency. They may come on strong, then disappear again, then return with even more emotional appeal. This push and pull dynamic is not accidental. It's part of how they test whether the door is still open. And if it is, the cycle doesn't reset into something healthier. It simply continues because the underlying structure of the relationship has never actually changed. When the attempts to pull you back in stop working, something much quieter and far more destabilizing begins to happen internally. This is the stage where the narcissist experiences a deeper crack in their identity, often referred to as an ego injury. Unlike the earlier anger, which was loud and outward, this phase is more internal, more contained, and far less visible to the outside world. For perhaps the first time, your absence becomes undeniable. You didn't just leave, you stayed gone. And that consistency disrupts one of their core beliefs, that they can always regain control whenever they choose. This is where a sense of insecurity begins to creep in, not necessarily about losing you as a person, but about what your departure represents. It challenges the illusion of superiority they depend on. They may not show this openly. In fact, outwardly, they can appear completely fine, posting, socializing, acting as though nothing has affected them. But internally, there is a kind of quiet collapse happening. The validation they once relied on is no longer coming from you. And if no immediate replacement has fully filled that gap, they are left sitting with a discomfort they don't know how to process. In rare moments, this can lead to a brief flicker of self-awareness. They might start to recognize patterns, recall their own behavior, or question why things keep ending the same way. But this reflection is usually shallow and short-lived because true introspection would require them to confront deeper vulnerabilities they have spent a lifetime avoiding. Instead of fully engaging with that discomfort, they tend to suppress it. They distract themselves, seek external validation elsewhere, or double down on protecting their image. This stage is not about healing, it's about containment, keeping that internal fracture from becoming something they have to truly face. In the final stage, the narcissist appears to move on. But what's really happening is adaptation, not healing. This is where they begin securing a new source of validation, often referred to as narcissistic supply, to stabilize the internal imbalance your absence created. A new person may enter their life quickly, and from the outside, it can look like they've replaced you without hesitation. This is intentional because maintaining the image of being unaffected is critical to their identity. Alongside this, they begin a process of rewriting the story. This isn't casual storytelling, it's a psychological restructuring of events to protect their self-image. In this rewritten version, they were the one who tried, the one who gave, the one who was wronged. You may be portrayed as difficult, unstable, or incapable of appreciating them. This process is closely tied to cognitive dissonance, where they reshape reality to eliminate the discomfort of seeing themselves as flawed or responsible. The new relationship, if there is one, often follows a familiar pattern. At first, it appears intense, almost idealized because they are re-establishing control and securing fresh supply. But since the underlying behaviors remain unchanged, the same cycle is likely to repeat over time. What looks like growth is usually repetition in a different form. Emotionally, this stage is about closure, but not in a healthy sense. It's about sealing off the parts of the experience that threaten their ego. They don't process the relationship in a way that leads to insight or accountability. Instead, they compartmentalize it, file it away in a version that keeps them intact. From your perspective, this stage can feel invalidating, even painful, because it may seem like everything you shared was easily replaced. But what it actually reveals is their inability to form stable, self-aware connections, relying instead on cycles that protect them from ever having to truly confront themselves. There isn't actually a sixth stage, and that's the part most people struggle to accept. What feels like a next phase is usually just a repetition or recycling of the same five patterns because the narcissist isn't operating from a place of growth. Their behavior is structured around preserving the self, not evolving it. So instead of moving forward in a healthy, linear way, they loop back, often without you even realizing it. After the replacement phase, what can happen is a quiet return of earlier dynamics, especially if their new source of validation becomes unstable or stops meeting their needs. This is where something like intermittent reinforcement comes into play. They are wired into cycles of inconsistency, seeking, securing, devaluing, and then seeking again. It's not random. It's a pattern that keeps them in control while keeping others emotionally hooked. You might hear from them again months or even years later, a message that seems casual, a memory brought up out of nowhere, an apology that feels delayed but oddly timed. This isn't a new stage of awareness or regret. It's the same hoovering impulse resurfacing when circumstances shift. The moment their control feels threatened elsewhere, they revisit past sources to see if access can be regained. What makes this confusing is that it can look different each time. They may appear calmer, more mature, even reflective, but if the underlying work hasn't been done, and it rarely has, the intention remains the same: to reconnect without accountability, to re-enter without change. So what feels like a stage 6 is really the illusion of transformation. In reality, it's the cycle trying to restart, testing whether the door you closed is still unlocked. There is no seventh stage, and by this point, that realization becomes the most important shift for you, not them. What can feel like a final phase is often just the long-term pattern settling into place, where distance, time, and silence create the illusion that something meaningful has changed on their side. But in reality, what you're witnessing is not evolution. It's emotional detachment combined with self-preservation. Over time, the narcissist integrates the past relationship into a version of their identity that doesn't threaten them. This is where mechanisms like emotional detachment take over. They disconnect from the emotional depth of what happened, not because they've processed it, but because staying connected to it would require accountability and vulnerability, two things they are structured to avoid. From the outside, this can look like complete closure. They no longer reach out, no longer react, no longer seem affected. In some cases, they may even appear genuinely content in their new life, but that appearance is carefully maintained. What's missing is true integration, the kind that comes from understanding, growth, and responsibility. Instead, they carry forward the same patterns, just applied to different people and situations. For you, this stage can feel like the final unanswered question: did I ever matter? And the painful truth is that the answer doesn't exist in the way you're hoping. Not because you didn't matter, but because their emotional framework doesn't allow for that kind of stable, consistent value of others. So, what feels like a seventh stage is really the absence of one. It's the point where their process ends, not with clarity, not with resolution, but with avoidance. And that's where your process begins to separate completely from theirs. Because while they remain in cycles, you now have the opportunity to step out of them entirely. There is no eighth stage, and recognizing that is where the deepest clarity begins. By the time you reach this point, what once felt like a complex emotional journey on their side starts to reveal itself as something much simpler and far more repetitive. The stages you've seen aren't steps toward growth, they're defenses against it. And beyond them, there isn't some hidden level where insight suddenly appears. There's just the continuation of the same internal structure. What may feel like a final distant phase is actually the full establishment of what psychology often refers to as narcissistic defense mechanisms. These are the patterns that protect their identity at all costs: denial, projection, rewriting reality, emotional shutdown. By now, these defenses are no longer reactive, they're stable. They've absorbed the experience in a way that keeps their self-image intact without requiring any meaningful change. From your perspective, this can create a strange kind of silence. No more messages, no more reactions, no more visible signs that the relationship ever mattered. It can feel like everything has been erased, but what's actually happening is not erasure, it's containment. They've placed the entire experience into a mental space where it can no longer threaten them. And in doing so, they've also removed any opportunity for genuine reflection. This is the point where many people wait for something that will never come: real regret, deep understanding, or a moment of accountability. But those things require dismantling the very defenses they rely on to function. And without that, there is no next stage, no hidden realization waiting to surface. So, what feels like an eighth stage is really the end of their process entirely, not an ending built on growth or insight, but one built on protection. And while their story closes in avoidance, yours opens in awareness, because you're no longer trying to understand what they'll become, but finally seeing clearly who they've always been. In the end, what you witnessed was never a journey of love turning into regret. It was a cycle of control reacting to loss. Each stage, from shock to replacement, wasn't about missing you as a person, but about losing access to what you provided. And once you see that clearly, something shifts inside you. The questions that once kept you stuck — did they care? Will they regret it? — start to lose their grip. Because the truth is, their process doesn't lead to insight, growth, or real accountability. It leads back to the same patterns, protected by layers of narcissistic defense mechanisms that keep them from ever fully facing themselves. And that means the closure you were waiting for was never going to come from them. It was always going to come from you. The moment you stop looking for their regret is the moment you reclaim your power. The moment you stop needing their understanding is the moment you find your own clarity. And the moment you truly accept that walking away didn't make you lose them, it's what finally allowed you to find yourself